The war had lasted for 300 years. It was a war without mercy, without victory, and without hope. Two great factions, the Tarkin Dominion and the Vrelith Confederacy, had been locked in battle for so long that neither side remembered why it had started. Generations were born into war, lived in war, and died in war. Entire planets had been reduced to dust, their civilizations wiped out as if they had never existed. The galaxy had given up on peace. No one believed the war would ever end. The Tarkans were strong, disciplined warriors, with powerful fleets and highly trained soldiers. The Vrelith were brutal conquerors, ruthless and intelligent, always finding new ways to strike. Both sides were evenly matched. Neither could gain the upper hand. The war had spread to every corner of the galaxy. The same battles were fought again and again, the same planets captured and lost, the same blood spilled for no reason. There was no longer a goal, only survival. Victory seemed impossible. The only certainty was more death. But then, something changed. A new species had been discovered, one that had remained hidden from the war. They were called humans. At first, they were ignored. They came from a distant planet, a small blue world known as Earth. The great empires did not see them as a threat. They were too weak, too primitive, too unimportant. But then, something strange happened. A Vrelith fleet, sent to conquer a minor system, vanished. It had entered human territory and was never heard from again. At first, the Vrelith believed it was a technical failure, a simple mistake. They sent another fleet. It disappeared too. Whispers spread across the war-torn galaxy. The humans were not responding to hails. They were not offering surrender or negotiation. They were silent, and yet their presence was impossible to ignore. The Tarkans became curious. They sent a scouting mission, only a few ships, just to observe. What they found shocked them. The humans were not weak. They were not primitive. They had weapons that defied logic, technology that seemed too advanced for such a young species. More than that, they fought differently. They did not battle like the Tarkans, who relied on strength and honor. They did not fight like the Vrelith, who used fear and brutality. Humans fought with strategy, deception, and precision. The Tarkan scouts watched in horror as a human warship, smaller than a Vrelith dreadnought, took down an entire enemy fleet without firing a single shot. The humans had hacked into the enemy systems, turning their own weapons against them. Ships exploded from the inside. Crews were locked in their own airlocks, and navigation systems sent vessels crashing into each other. It was a massacre without a battle. For the first time in 300 years, something had changed. The galaxy had seen endless war. It had seen mighty fleets clash, planets burn, and empires crumble. But it had never seen this. Humanity had entered the war, and nothing would ever be the same again. The Vrelith were furious. A single fleet lost could be explained, but two fleets vanishing without a trace was something else. They sent scouts, spies, and deep space probes. Each one tried to investigate what had happened, and each one disappeared. The Vrelith High Command refused to believe that a primitive species could be responsible. It was impossible. Humanity had no history of war on a galactic scale. They had no great empire, no colonies stretching across the stars. Their planet was isolated, their technology unknown. And yet something was eliminating their forces with terrifying efficiency. The Tarkan Dominion watched in silence. They had suffered their own losses against the Vrelith, and they saw an opportunity. If this new species was responsible, perhaps they could be useful. The Tarkans did not trust easily, but they respected power. The Vrelith, on the other hand, responded with brute force. If humans were behind the missing fleets, they would crush them. The Vrelith sent a massive fleet, far larger than before. This time, they would not just invade human space. They would erase it. 300 warships, armed with the most advanced weapons in the galaxy, launched toward Earth's outer colonies. The mission was simple: find humanity's defenses, destroy them, and show the galaxy that the Vrelith could not be challenged. The fleet never arrived. It sent one final transmission before going silent. The message contained no distress calls, no battle reports, no sign of resistance. Just 3 words in perfect galactic standard. Turn back now. Panic spread through the Vralith leadership. This was no accident, no malfunction. Humanity was watching them. They knew the fleet was coming, and instead of responding with threats or negotiations, they sent a warning, calm, direct, and terrifying. The Vralith could not allow themselves to be intimidated. Another fleet was prepared, even larger than the last. This time, they sent their best admirals, their most experienced warriors. Every ship was checked for potential sabotage, every system monitored. They would not be taken by surprise again. But before they could even launch, the fleet's central command station lost all power. Every screen went black. Every ship in orbit shut down. Not a single system functioned. It lasted only for a minute, but it was enough. When the systems rebooted, a single message appeared on every screen. This is your last chance. The Vralith Supreme Commander stared at the message, his claws digging into the armrest of his throne. No one had ever spoken to the Vralith like this. No one had ever dared. But the worst part wasn't the words. It was the realization that the humans had hacked into their entire military network without even trying. The Tarkans received the same message. Unlike the Vralith, they did not see it as a threat. They saw a display of power. A war had lasted for 3 centuries without a victor. And now a new force had appeared, one that did not rely on brute strength or sheer numbers. The Tarkan High General made a bold decision. Instead of attacking humanity, he sent a diplomatic team. The Tarkan ships approached the Sol system carefully, broadcasting a peaceful signal. No weapons were armed, no threats were made. The humans did not respond at first. The Tarkans had never been ignored before. Even the Vralith had always answered their hails, even if it was to threaten them. But Earth remained silent. Then, at last, a response came. A human voice, calm and composed, spoke over the communication channel. "We do not seek war, but we will end one if necessary." The Tarkans listened. For the first time in history, they saw a chance, not just to survive, but to win. If humanity was truly as powerful as they seemed, then the war could finally be over. The only question was, whose side were they on? The Vralith had no interest in negotiations. They had ruled through fear and conquest for centuries. They would not stop now. But something had changed. For the first time in 300 years, they were afraid. And the war was about to take a turn no one expected. The galaxy had known war for so long that peace had become a forgotten dream. For 300 years, the Tarkan Dominion and the Vralith Confederacy had fought a war with no end in sight. Millions had died. Worlds had turned to dust. Star systems had been emptied of life, leaving behind only the cold silence of space. And yet, in all those years, no force had ever changed the tide of battle. No empire, no rebellion, no new weapon had been enough to tip the balance. The 2 factions were too evenly matched. They knew each other's strategies, their strengths, their weaknesses. It was a war fought by warriors who had spent their entire lives preparing for battle. But then, humanity arrived. No one had seen them coming. No one had expected them to be a threat. They had been an unknown species, confined to a small section of space. They had no great empire, no vast fleets, no legendary warriors. And yet, they had done what no one else could. They had made the Vralith afraid. The Vralith High Command refused to accept it. They could not. Their entire civilization was built on conquest. They were feared across the galaxy, their fleets unstoppable, their armies ruthless. No species had ever stood against them and survived. The idea that some unknown race from a forgotten corner of space could challenge them was unthinkable. But the evidence was undeniable. Their fleets had vanished without a fight. Their military networks had been hacked. Their homeworld defenses had been shut down with a single command. The humans had given them warnings. Turn back or face the consequences. The Vralith had ignored the first warning. They had ignored the second. Now, they would pay the price. A Vralith fleet, positioned near the edge of human space, was the first to experience the full wrath of humanity. They had been stationed there for weeks, waiting for orders to strike. They had expected to be the ones to bring fire and destruction to Earth's colonies. Instead, they were the ones who burned. The attack came with no warning. There was no grand battle, no exchange of fire. The Vralith warships simply ceased to function. Their engines died, their weapons refused to fire, their shields collapsed. The fleet's admiral, a seasoned veteran of countless battles, watched in horror as his command ship systems turned against him. Security doors locked the crew inside their own ship. Airlocks opened into the vacuum of space. Life support shut down, leaving the warriors gasping for breath as the oxygen drained from their ship. Then, from the darkness of space, the human ships appeared. They were smaller than Vralith warships, built for speed and precision rather than brute force. But size did not matter. The humans did not need massive war machines to win. They fought with strategy, deception, and control. The Vralith fleet, once proud and powerful, was reduced to lifeless husks in a matter of minutes. The humans never fired a shot. They never needed to. The Vralith had been defeated before they even knew the battle had begun. News of the disaster spread quickly. The Vralith High Command was in chaos. For the first time in history, they were not the hunters, but the hunted. The Tarkin Dominion had been watching carefully. They had been at war with the Vralith for centuries, always locked in an endless struggle. Now, they saw an opportunity. The humans were not just another enemy. They were something different, something dangerous, and perhaps something useful. The Tarkin High General made a decision that would change the course of the war. He sent a message to Earth, not as a threat, but as an offer. We have fought the Vralith for 300 years. We have shed blood, lost worlds, and endured suffering beyond measure. But we have never seen them afraid, until now. We wish to speak, not as enemies, but as warriors who share a common foe. Humanity, will you fight with us? The message was sent. The galaxy held its breath, waiting for a response. And when it came, it was only 2 words. We're coming. The war was about to change forever. The moment humanity's response was received, the Tarkin Dominion knew the war had changed. For 3 centuries, the struggle against the Vralith had been nothing but death and despair, a cycle of destruction that seemed impossible to break. But now, there was hope, a terrifying, unstoppable hope. The Tarkin High General, an old and battle-worn warrior, stood in silence as he watched the transmission replay. We're coming. 2 simple words, but they carried the weight of a storm. The humans had not promised alliance, negotiation, or peace. They had simply promised action. And when the humans made a promise, they delivered. The Vralith Confederacy was still reeling from the loss of their fleets. Their military council demanded answers, but no one had them. How had their warships been shut down without a fight? How had an unknown species infiltrated their systems? How had a civilization with no galactic empire brought the most feared warriors in the galaxy to their knees? The Vralith were not used to fear, and fear made them reckless. Their supreme commander ordered an all-out strike against human space. He would not wait for diplomacy, nor would he allow the rumors of humanity's power to spread any further. The Vralith were conquerors. They had burned worlds, wiped out species, and ruled through strength for generations. They would not be defeated by ghosts. A new fleet was assembled, the largest in Vralith history. 500 warships, each armed with weapons that had shattered planets. This was not a simple invasion, it was extermination. The Supreme Commander had no interest in conquering Earth. He wanted to erase it. But as the fleet prepared to launch, something unexpected happened. The humans struck first. The Vralith had expected an enemy that fought like everyone else, with fleets, with soldiers, with grand battles in space. But humanity had no interest in fighting a fair war. The first sign of their attack was silence. One by one, Vrelith warships went dark. Their communication channels died. Their targeting systems failed. Their engines sputtered and stopped. Entire squadrons drifted helplessly in space, their pilots screaming for answers. And then the explosions began. The humans had planted something inside Vrelith technology. No one knew when or how it had happened. But in an instant, warships that had stood for centuries detonated from within. Hundreds of Vrelith warriors, some of the fiercest fighters in the galaxy, were wiped out in seconds. The Supreme Commander watched in horror as his unstoppable fleet became a graveyard. But it wasn't just the fleet. The humans had gone deeper. Much deeper. On Vrelith-controlled planets, entire defense networks collapsed. Military bases lost power. War factories were disabled. Weapons refused to fire. The very systems the Vrelith relied on for their empire had been turned against them. The humans had done something the Vrelith had never thought possible. They had hacked the war itself. The galaxy was watching. And so was the Tarkan Dominion. For centuries, the Tarkans had fought the Vrelith in brutal, bloody wars. They had suffered countless losses, losing entire generations to the endless conflict. Now, for the first time, they saw their enemy on the verge of collapse. And they knew what they had to do. The Tarkan High General gathered his war council. There was no need for debate. The decision had already been made. They would strike now. While the Vrelith reeled from humanity's unseen attack, the Tarkans launched a full-scale assault. Their fleets, battle-hardened from centuries of war, tore through weakened Vrelith defenses like a blade through flesh. But as they advanced, they noticed something strange. Human ships were already there. Sleek, dark vessels moved through the chaos with terrifying precision. They did not engage in prolonged battles. They did not fight for honor or territory. They moved like predators, striking only where it hurt the most. A Tarkan commander, watching from his warship, whispered in awe, "They're not fighting a war. They're hunting." The Vrelith Supreme Commander, once the most powerful warrior in the galaxy, was now a desperate, broken leader. He had always believed his people were invincible. Now, as his empire crumbled, he realized the truth. The war was no longer his to control, and the humans had only just begun. The Vrelith Supreme Commander stood in the heart of his dying empire, watching the impossible unfold. His fleets had been neutralized before they could even engage. His military networks had been turned against him. His warriors, once the most feared in the galaxy, were scattered, leaderless, afraid. For 300 years, the Vrelith had ruled through strength. Now that strength was useless, and the enemy responsible for this disaster, a species the Vrelith had never even considered a threat. Humans. The Supreme Commander slammed his fist against the control panel. "How?" he growled, his voice shaking with rage. The silence in the war chamber was deafening. No one had an answer. And then, a transmission came through. It was not from his surviving admirals. It was not from his scattered fleets. It was from the humans. The hologram flickered to life. A human commander stood before him. He was not armored. He wore no medals. His face was calm, unreadable. And yet, in his eyes, there was something far more terrifying than rage or hatred. There was certainty. "You lost the war before it even started," the human said. His voice was steady, as if he were simply stating a fact. "You just didn't know it yet." The Supreme Commander's claws tightened. "You dare speak to me this way? You expected us to fight like you," the human continued, ignoring the threat. "You thought we would come in, guns blazing, desperate for battle." He leaned forward. "But humans don't fight fair. We fight to win." The Supreme Commander let out a guttural snarl. "You think you've won already." The human smirked. And then the lights flickered. The war chamber's emergency alarms blared to life. A second later, every screen in the room turned black. The Supreme Commander looked around, confused, furious, afraid. A whisper of static filled the air. Then came a voice. System override complete. Authorization. Human command. The Supreme Commander's blood ran cold. He turned to his officers. Get me the fleet. Sir, one of them interrupted, voice trembling. We've lost control. The Supreme Commander's eyes widened. What? The officer swallowed hard. They have our ships, sir. Our defense platforms. Our war factories. Everything. A deep silence filled the chamber. The Vrelith High Command had spent centuries perfecting their military technology. It was their pride, their power. And now it was no longer theirs. The Supreme Commander turned back to the hologram. The human was still standing there, watching him, calm as ever. Your empire is finished, the human said. You can fight back. You can send your remaining forces, but it won't change the outcome. The Supreme Commander bared his fangs. You don't understand. We are warriors. We do not surrender. The human nodded. We expected that. And then he said something that sent a chill through the room. That's why we're not giving you the option. The Supreme Commander barely had time to process those words before it happened. A tremor shook the war chamber, not from an explosion, not from an attack, but from inside their own base. The humans had already infiltrated their world. One of the officers let out a strangled cry. Sir, we've lost control of the planetary defense grid. The Supreme Commander's mind raced. Impossible. It's protected by. Their code is overriding everything. Another officer shouted. Sir, there. Boom. A massive explosion rocked the chamber. The Supreme Commander barely managed to stay on his feet as the lights flickered and died. And then, darkness. Silence. A single voice echoed through the dead screens. Your time is over. Then the invasion began. The Tarkin Dominion had never seen anything like it. For centuries, they had fought the Vrelith in brutal, drawn-out wars. But this was something else. The humans didn't just fight battles. They ended them. By the time the Tarkin fleets arrived at the heart of Vrelith space, the war was already lost. Vrelith warships drifted lifelessly, their systems locked down by human code. Massive defense platforms that once guarded entire planets now fired upon their own forces. Military bases had been shut down before a single shot was fired. And the Vrelith warriors, those legendary conquerors who had ruled the stars, were surrendering. Not because they had been beaten in battle, not because they had been outgunned, but because they had been outmatched. A Tarkin admiral, watching from his flagship, turned to his human counterpart. You did all of this without a war? He asked in disbelief. The human commander smiled. No, this was a war. He gestured to the wreckage, to the broken empire. We just fought it smarter. The Tarkin admiral let out a low breath. He had always believed the Vrelith were unbeatable. He had spent his life fighting them, losing friends, watching planets burn. Now, in a matter of hours, the humans had accomplished the impossible. Where do we go from here? He asked. The human's smile faded. His voice was calm, but there was something cold beneath it. That depends, he said, on whether the Vrelith learn their lesson. The admiral turned back to the ruins of the once great Vrelith war machine. Somehow he doubted they would. A Tarkin admiral, watching from his flagship, turned to his human counterpart. You did all of this without a war? He asked in disbelief. The human commander smiled. No, this was a war. He gestured to the wreckage, to the broken empire. We just fought it smarter. The Tarkin admiral let out a low breath. He had always believed the Vrelith were unbeatable. He had spent his life fighting them, losing friends, watching planets burn. Now, in a matter of hours, the humans had accomplished the impossible. Where do we go from here? He asked. The human's smile faded. His voice was calm, but there was something cold beneath it. That depends, he said, On whether the Vrelith learned their lesson. The admiral turned back to the ruins of the once great Vrelith war machine. Somehow he doubted they would. A Tarkan admiral, watching from his flagship, turned to his human counterpart. "You did all of this without a war?" he asked in disbelief. The human commander smiled. "No, this was a war." He gestured to the wreckage, to the broken empire. "We just fought it smarter." The Tarkan admiral let out a low breath. He had always believed the Vrelith were unbeatable. He had spent his life fighting them, losing friends, watching planets burn. Now, in a matter of hours, the humans had accomplished the impossible. "Where do we go from here?" he asked. The human's smile faded. His voice was calm, but there was something cold beneath it. "That depends," he said, "on whether the Vrelith learned their lesson." The admiral turned back to the ruins of the once great Vrelith war machine. Somehow he doubted they would. The supreme commander of the Vrelith Empire sat in the ruins of what was once the most powerful war chamber in the galaxy. His claws gripped the edges of his throne, his breathing heavy. The weight of defeat crushed him more than any physical wound ever could. He had spent centuries leading his people in war, conquering worlds, subjugating species. The Vrelith were the strongest, the undisputed rulers of war. No one had ever come close to matching them. Until now. Until the humans arrived. And now, everything was gone. The planetary defenses were offline. The Empire's vast fleets were immobilized. Entire armies had surrendered without firing a single shot. And the worst part, the war had barely lasted 5 hours. "Sir," an officer rushed into the chamber, his voice frantic. "The humans. They have taken the core systems. They are broadcasting a message across all channels." The Supreme Commander clenched his jaw. "What message?" The officer hesitated before pulling up the transmission on the nearest surviving console. The screen flickered, and then the human commander appeared. It was the same man from before, the one who had mocked them, the one who had stood there, completely calm, as he dismantled the entire empire. And once again, he wasn't gloating. His expression was cold, calculated. He was not here to revel in victory. He was here to end this war completely. "This is Commander Ryan of the United Terran Forces." The human's voice echoed across every surviving Vrelith command center, every remaining warship. "Your empire is over." The Supreme Commander gritted his teeth. "You fought well," the human continued. "For centuries, you ruled through strength. You believed the galaxy could only be controlled by force." The Supreme Commander let out a low growl. "But you made a mistake," the human said, his voice sharp. "You thought power came from brute strength. You never considered that real power comes from control." A deep silence followed those words. Then, the lights dimmed again. The Supreme Commander's eyes widened as every remaining system in the war chamber shut down. Consoles flickered off. Emergency lights died out. Even the officer's communicator went silent. A metallic voice filled the room. "Final override complete. All Vrelith systems under Terran command." The Supreme Commander stood up so fast his chair collapsed. "What HFY SCRIP?" he roared. The human commander's expression didn't change. "We gave you a choice," he said simply. "You could have surrendered. You could have lived." His voice dropped lower. "But you refused." The Supreme Commander's breathing was ragged. You think we will just let you take everything." "You don't have a choice," the human replied. "Your weapons are locked. Your fleets are dead in space. Your own planets are turning against you. The war is over." The Supreme Commander shook with fury. His people had built the greatest military force in the galaxy. They had crushed entire civilizations. They had fought for 300 years. And yet, 5 hours. That's all it took for the humans to erase everything. His claws dug into his palms. "We are warriors. We do not surrender." The human's gaze was steady. "Then you will vanish." The Supreme Commander's heart pounded. A deep primal fear crept into his chest. And then the final blow fell. The holographic screens in the chamber lit up with new images. They showed the core planets of the Vrelith Empire, the heart of their civilization. One by one, red symbols appeared over each world. Terran forces had taken them without firing a single shot. Entire planets had turned against the Empire, surrendering willingly. And then, the Supreme Commander saw it. His homeworld, Vrelith Prime. A red symbol glowed over it. Captured. The Supreme Commander let out a low, broken sound. His mind raced, trying to deny it, trying to find a way out. But there was none. There was no Empire left to command. A soft beep echoed in the chamber. The officer's trembling claws pressed a button. A message appeared on the screen. From the High Generals of Vrelith Prime. We surrender. The Supreme Commander felt his knees buckle. It was over. Not just the war. The Vrelith Empire itself. The human commander watched him in silence. Then, with a final nod, the hologram flickered out. The Supreme Commander sank into his fallen chair, staring at the lifeless consoles around him. His empire had lasted for centuries. It had ended in hours. The Supreme Commander of the Vrelith Empire sat in absolute silence. His claws trembled. His breath came in short gasps. His empire was gone. Not in years, not in months. In 5 hours. The message from the High Generals burned in his mind. We surrender. That was it. The final blow. The end. The war chamber, once a place of power and strategy, now felt empty. The screens that had once displayed battle plans and conquests now only showed one thing: the insignia of the United Terran Forces. The humans had taken everything. He had commanded billions. He had ruled with fear. He had crushed rebellions before they even began. And now, he was powerless. The doors of the war chamber hissed open. Boots echoed against the cold metal floor. The Supreme Commander didn't need to look up. He knew who had arrived. Commander Ryan. The human approached with the same calm expression he had carried throughout the entire war. No rage, no cruelty, no arrogance. Just cold, ruthless efficiency. The Supreme Commander forced himself to lift his gaze. His voice, once powerful enough to command armies, now came out as a whisper. How? Ryan didn't blink. You ruled with fear, he said simply. But fear is a weak foundation. It crumbles the moment something stronger arrives. The Supreme Commander's throat tightened. We were the strongest, he rasped. You were, Ryan agreed, until we came. Silence stretched between them. The weight of defeat crushed the Supreme Commander's soul. Ryan took a step closer. This is how it ends, he said. No more war. No more conquest. The galaxy won't be ruled by terror anymore. The Supreme Commander gritted his teeth. And what will the humans rule with? Ryan's gaze was unreadable. Something better. The Supreme Commander let out a bitter laugh. You think the galaxy will accept your rule? Ryan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned slightly and gestured. A screen flickered to life. The Supreme Commander's eyes widened. Vrelith Prime, his homeworld. Celebrations. His own people, cheering. Not in fear. Not in defiance. In relief. The Supreme Commander's claws dug into the armrests of his chair. He couldn't understand it. Why? Why weren't they fighting back? Why weren't they resisting? Ryan's voice cut through his thoughts. They were tired of war, he said. The moment they saw a chance for peace, they took it. The Supreme Commander felt a cold numbness spread through his chest. Had his people wanted this all along? For centuries, he had believed war was the only path, the only way to survive. But now, there was no war. And instead of collapse, his empire was rebuilding. Without him, his own people had moved on. The Supreme Commander slumped back into his seat. For the first time in his long life, he felt truly defeated. Ryan stepped back, giving him one last look. It's over, he said. You have one choice left. The Supreme Commander didn't respond. Ryan didn't wait for one. He turned, motioned to his soldiers, and walked away. The doors hissed shut behind him. The Supreme Commander stared at the empty war chamber. The war was over.